So the first question here, Caroline, is they're asking you to find the inverse of this function f of x. So remember, the f of x is just the y value, and so we're going to start by switching the positions of the x and the y. So the y will become x, and the x will become y. Kind of like an example we worked through together kind of like what we did in our time together the other day. So we've switched every y to x and every x to y, and now what we have to do is try to solve for y. So one thing is, we notice our y is in the denominator. We'd like to get it out of the denominator. So let's multiply both sides of our equation by y minus 8. This is a tricky one. So I'm going to do that over here as well. And that'll make this y minus 8 cancel from the denominator. And we'll have x times y minus 8 is equal to 2y. Okay, well, we want to get our y's together, so that means we're going to have to distribute this x. So we'll have x times y minus x times 8. All right, so now let's bring our y's together. I'll bring this xy over with the other y on the other side. And now I've got negative 8x is equal to 2y minus xy. All right. Now, we're trying to solve for y. Each of these two things on the right side of the equal sign has a y in it. So we're going to factor out that y. So we're going to use a little factoring here. We're going to divide the 2y by y. That'll leave us with 2. And we're going to divide the xy by y, and that'll leave us with x. So we factored out the y. If you redistribute, y times 2 is 2y, and y times negative x is negative xy. So that works. Now, because y is being multiplied by 2 minus x, I want to undo that multiplication. So the opposite of multiplying is dividing. So I'm going to have to divide by 2 minus x. And that gets my y alone. I now know over here that y is equal to negative 8x over 2 minus x. Parentheses are not necessary, but they are okay. So that would give us our equation for f inverse of x. So f inverse of x would be equal to negative 8x over 2 minus x. So that's our first answer. Now the next question is about the domain of f inverse. Domain we know is all about the x, and whenever we're dealing with a function that has an x in the bottom, then we've got to think about the values that x cannot have. The denominator of a fraction cannot equal 0. So they want us to use interval notation, so we've got to say, okay, let's take that denominator of 2 minus x and let's set it equal to 0 and find what value of x makes that denominator 0. Clearly, 2 minus 2 is 0. So that means x cannot have a value equal to, because if x did equal 2, then the bottom of our fraction would be equal to 0, and we cannot divide by 0. The numerator of the fraction has an x in it as well, but you can have any value of x in the numerator. That makes no difference. So therefore, we have in our domain all values of x except the number 2. And so we would identify our domain as anything from negative infinity to 2, not including 2, which is why I'm using a parenthesis, union anything from 2 to positive infinity. Again, not including 2, so that's why I'm putting a parenthesis. So that would be my domain using interval notation. So then the next question is, what is the range? So when we think about the range, we're thinking about the values that y could have. And so you've got to think about the possible results that you would get when you take negative 8x and you divide by 2 minus x for any imaginable value of x except the number 2. Well, you're going to find that y can just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Y could keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And therefore, our range would be all real numbers. And in interval notation, that of course would be from negative infinity to positive infinity. Now, if it's hard to recognize that y could keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and x could keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller, you could start to just make a table of values for x and y and see what's happening, or table of values for x and find y, and see what appears to be happening to the y. I'm going to do that on my next blank page. Okay, so I've got the equation y equals negative 8x all over 2 minus x. So if I just started to substitute values in for x and find the corresponding y value, and you could take the time to compute these yourself, but I just want to quickly demonstrate what some of these values would be. Initially, I substituted integers from negative 4 to 4, not including 2, in for y, and I can see that my y values at negative 4 is 5.3, and at positive 4, it's 16. If I kept going, I can see that beyond an x value of 3, my y's are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Beyond an x value of negative 4, if I continue to plug numbers in, those values are getting larger and larger and larger. So what's happening if we kept plugging in different values for x to find the corresponding y values, we're going to find that every real number is a possible value of y. Now, just a note, if you took the time to start to graph this function, this is not a precise graph, but it kind of gives you a picture. This graph looks something like this. And so you can see on the left end it continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger, which is what I was just saying, that as x becomes more and more negative, like negative 5, negative 6, negative 7, and so on, y is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, whereas when x is getting larger, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, y is getting smaller. So our domain is in fact our range is in fact all real numbers. And so when we identify that range in interval notation, we would just say every number from negative infinity to positive infinity.